Bom, então boa tarde a todos, boa tarde Adrian, boa tarde Pedro. Sejam bem-vindos e bem-vindas a mais um debate especial do projeto História em Quarentena, um projeto nascido em razão da necessidade de confinamento e de afastamento físico por causa da atual crise sanitária do coronavírus. A nossa ideia é aproveitar as possibilidades que as ferramentas digitais oferecem para reforçar o sentido de coletividade. Desde o dia 23 de março de 2020, organizamos uma série de lives no Facebook com a participação de uma pesquisadora ou um pesquisador falando sobre alguma problematização inserida em uma temática geral que muda a cada semana. Além disso, preparamos uma série de debates especiais gravados via Skype ou via Google Meet entre diferentes especialistas com a intenção de discutir o tema semanal proposto. O História em Quarentena é um projeto organizado por Melanie Toulois, Paulo César Gomes, Carlos Benítez Trinidad, Lucas Pedretti, Natália Grelos e por mim, Mariana Meneses Munhoz. Hoje, nós temos o prazer de conversar com o professor Pedro Cardim, da Universidade Nova de Lisboa. O professor Pedro Cardim é historiador e membro do CHAM Centro de Humanidades em Portugal. Uma das suas publicações recentes intitula-se Os Povos Indígenas, a Dominação Colonial e as Instâncias de Justiça na América Portuguesa e Espanhola, que está no livro Os Indígenas e as Justiças no Mundo Ibérico-Americano, séculos XVI e XIX, publicado pelo Centro de História da Universidade de Lisboa em 2019. Este texto está disponível na internet e, ao igual que a sua produção, que é publicada em diversos idiomas como português, inglês e espanhol. Também temos o prazer de dialogar com o Dr. Adrian Martins, também historiador, da Eberhard, Karls, Universität Tübingen, na Alemanha. O artigo mais recente do Dr. Masters intitula-se Basel's The Petition and Response System and the Creation of Spanish Imperial Castle Legislation, publicado na American Historical Review em 2018. A sua produção intelectual também está disponível na internet em inglês. Então, a conversa vai girar em torno a uma série de questões, tendo como tema os grupos subalternos, grupos não pertencentes às elites na sociedade ibérica, no período moderno. Good evening, Professor Pedro Cardim. Good evening, Dr. Adrian Masters, and good evening, everyone, to one more session of debates on History in Quarantine. This project, History in Quarantine, was born to the needed confinement and social distancing because of the current coronavirus crisis. Our idea is to disseminate historical knowledge, taking advantage of the possibilities offered by digital tools to enforce the sense of collectivity. Since March 23rd, we organized a series of lives via Facebook with the participation of researchers who talk about the problem, which is inserted into a general theme that changes every week. Besides that, we prepared a series of special debates between different specialized with the intention of discussing the proposed weekly topic. History in Quarantine is coordinated by the historians Melanie Toulois, Paulo César Gomes, Carlos Benítez Trinidad, Lucas Pedretti, Natália Grelos, and me, Mariana Meneses Munhoz. Our 17th week has as its theme colonial history and early modern history. What can we learn about it? And it has been a week rich in debates and diversity topics such as changes in food consumptions of indigenous people in the New Kingdom of Granada, smugglers, and rebellion on the Isthmus of Panama, the epidemics and diseases, and colonial visions of Brazil. Today, we have the pleasure to talk with Professor Pedro Cardim from New Lisbon University. Professor Cardim is a historian and he is part of CHAM Humanities Center in Portugal. One of his recent publications is the chapter in Portuguese Os Povos Indígenas, a Dominação Colonial e as Instâncias da Justiça na América Portuguesa e Espanhola. On the book, Os Indígenas e as Justiças no Mundo Ibérico-Americano, séculos XVI e XIX, published by the Center of History at University of Lisbon in 2019. Available on internet, and his production is published in different languages, such as Portuguese, English, and Spanish. We also have the pleasure to dialogue with Dr. Adrian Masters, historian too, from Eberhard Karls Universität Tübingen in Germany. A recent article of Dr. Masters is "A Thousand Invisible Architects, Vessels, the Petition and Response System, and the Creation of Spanish Imperial Castle Legislation," published on the American Historical Review in 2018. His production is also available on internet, published in English. This debate conversation will revolve around a series of questions that has as topic subaltern groups, non-elite groups, in the Iberian societies in the early modern period. Professor Cardim and Dr. Masters have a shared interest in the juridical construction of different social groups in the territories that corresponded to the Portuguese and Spanish crown during the early modern period. Present in the work of both scholars are topics such as governance between the so-called Old and New Worlds, racial categories, and corresponding legal status, and the more broad project of conceptualizing and reconceptualizing the ways to think about the justice on this period and the different groups. In this sense, your work, together with the historiographical production of the last 3 decades, has demonstrated that during the early modern period, social constructions and instances of justice were anything but static and rigid. Rather, in the imperial context, contact and social mobility went hand in hand with the establishment of categories and laws designed to order the world society, which simultaneously generated dynamics of restriction, benefits, and even protection. So our first question is, how were non-elite groups constructed and draw from other disciplines and sources to formulate these constructions? First is Professor Adrian Masters, then Professor Pedro Cardim. Thank you.
Hi, and just to start off, I want to thank Mariana and Pedro for inviting me. It's very kind of you. So to jump right into the question, we're dealing with this mystery as historians. Why, how do legal categories function? How do non-elite legal categories function? There's a historiography that argues that a lot of Iberian legal categories jump from the old world to the new world, and we see that in categories like pechero, a commoner, vecino, which is like a resident. There's thousands of them. And they jump from the old world to the new world, and that makes good sense, and it fits in with the old kind of European transplant account of how these categories work. And then there are some other categories which are particularly interesting to historians, where you get categories which seem to flourish and develop new meanings in the new world. And the subset of these has been particularly interesting to historians, what I would call categories of human difference, and which a lot of people today call racial categories. And of course, I put that within scare quotes because racial, it's a very complicated word to use in the 1500s, the 1600s, and even in the 1700s in the Iberian context. I just use it sometimes throughout this talk as a way of connecting with other scholarship, but I'm not arguing that we had the same, that our racial ideas from the 19th and 20th centuries and 21st centuries are the same as those previous ones. But going back to the 1500s and the 1600s, where you see the emergence of a lot of really important legal categories in the New World, how scholars explain them? And I would say the overall tendency has been structuralist claims. For example, racial categories come from the state. Racial categories arise from economic structures. Racial categories emerge from culture, or elites create them without very much explanation as to how that happens. And scholars have been using sources to make those claims, of course. They're not pulling them out of thin air. 3 sources that tend to be particularly important, I think, are royal decrees, where the king says such and such group has to do this or can't do that. Another source that you see a lot is commentaries by jurists, where a certain person trained in the law will explore what it means to be Indian, for example. And then the other really major one is cast paintings, these fascinating paintings where sometimes there's like 32 or 64 different supposed racial categories and crosses, and they're very exotic items. They're very popular in our understandings of human difference, and they kind of embody the Spanish Empire for a lot of people, these wonderful giant paintings, which are specifically from the 1700s. But I have a very different finding about how these legal categories emerge in the 1500s specifically. And my primary sources aren't paintings or commentaries or just royal decrees. I've been matching royal decrees to petitions. And this does a couple of things. First of all, I've been finding that petitioners are the ones who are proposing to the distant crown that the crown should take a certain approach on Indians, for example. Or they're proposing them to the viceroys, and then the viceroys or the crown respond. Not only that, but we can identify individuals and maybe even reconstruct some of the conflicts that they're struggling through to identify why maybe someone wanted Indians not to be able to do this or Spaniards not to be able to do that, which is very different from these structuralist, very top-down, impersonal explanations for where these categories come from. And of course, then there's a question, how many people could actually write letters to the king? How many people could petition? A lot. And they did it in the hundreds of thousands. We don't have all of the petitions left. Sometimes fragments of them are left inside the decree. Sometimes we actually have the original petitions. When you compare the petition to the decree, oftentimes, almost always, what you find is that the king's decree or the viceroy's decree actually just took the language from the petition and put it into the law. Why? Because the king and the viceroy didn't know the specifics of each case, and they were busy, and their secretaries were busy, and it's just easier to say, well, if this petition is true, and I think it is, I'm just going to take the excerpt and say, okay, do what this guy said. That means that the racial categories aren't coming from some colonial mastermind, some kind of shadowy elite, but from this dialogue between petitioners and officials. And I think this helps us understand why the Spanish Empire develops categories like mulatto, which is part black, or mestizo, which is part Indian, part Spanish, and why the emergence of these categories is so strange and so gradual, and why the categories don't sometimes contradict each other. So, taking this archival perspective kind of flips the script for the 16th century and opens up, I think, a new avenue for understanding why European states issue decrees about human difference. And with that, I'll give the floor to Pedro.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I'd like to thank the invitation for taking part in this conversation. It's a conversation about the topics Mariana and the rest of the organizers have established as the guidelines for our debate. Answering to your question, my personal motivation as an historian and also as a citizen of a country that has a really long and very much present colonial past. When I started working on the so-called subaltern groups in colonial Brazil was first to address a topic and a section of the colonial society that was not at all in the center of the attention of Portuguese historians. Portuguese scholarship on colonial Brazil is very much oriented to elite groups, institutional history. I come from that very milieu, so studying institutional history, political history, social history, but mostly focusing on the elites, which is very important, no doubt about it, and that was needed. But at a certain point, I realized that there was something or some section of society missing in those approaches, and that's how I decided to interact more and more with historians from Brazil, from North America, scholars specialized in colonial Latin America in broad terms, but focusing on on the indigenous groups and their role in colonial society. And that made me become a lot more aware of the need to incorporate in the more usual accounts of colonial Brazil the so-called indigenous actors, men and women of indigenous descent were, of course, playing a very active role in the whole developments that were taking place. So I did it more as an historian, trying to develop different approaches in the Portuguese media. For instance, in my particular case, I spent many years as board member of a research center. So part of my responsibility was to manage research groups and also serve as mentor of younger researchers. And one of the things that always struck me was the fact that in Portugal, no young researcher or senior researcher, with very few exceptions, picked a topic like this. So give center stage to an indigenous woman and devote a whole body of research and scholarship to studying that particular woman or that particular man or mestizo. So the perception that there was this very imbalanced situation within the Portuguese historiography made me, on one hand, start paying more attention to that particular section of Brazilian colonial society, but also encourage more younger researchers to devote or to incorporate in their own projects this section of Brazilian colonial society. Of course, this insistence on giving center stage to indigenous women and men in colonial Brazil was also the result of the fact that I was lucky enough to interact with really outstanding scholars such as Stuart Schwartz and João Reis and John Monteiro. I had contact with him briefly, but a very important one. So scholars from Brazil, from the US, and from different parts of Latin America, for whom dealing with colonial history with a very strong component of indigenous history was something completely normal, natural. Whereas in Portugal, that was definitely not the case. In Brazil, it depends on the historiographic media as we're talking about, but in Portugal, it was definitely not the case. So what I tried to do with my modest means and also with part of my individual research was to bridge the gap between those who were working on colonial Brazil, but more from a political and institutional point of view, and the very few who were doing indigenous history of colonial Brazil. And so bridging those two groups, establishing a connection between those two groups proved to be a fascinating work, and I've been learning since then immensely with this kind of interaction I'm having and trying to connect and put the indigenous peoples in not necessarily in the center, but make them play the role of historical actors, just like the people of European descent to whom most of the researches are devoted. So this made me feel more and more interested in learning about the topics Adrian has just mentioned. So how this juridical, theological, moral categories coming from Europe were transferred to the American continent, and how they operated in a colonial setting, how they were transplanted and imposed over an enormous group of very heterogeneous people from in terms of ethnicities, in terms of gender, in terms of their cultural backgrounds. So all these categories coming from Europe were on one hand imposed as part of the colonial project, but then of course the interplay between these categories, between these normative orders with the local categories and normative orders, which did not at all disappear, as we all know today. On the contrary, they were kind of reinvented. They had to adjust. They had to accommodate themselves to the institutions and to the categories of the colonists. But they went on being there in many different ways. And so this interplay was basically what I found more interesting for my own personal research. I have a legal history background, and so at a certain point it was clear to me that just taking into account the European categories and normative systems and see how they were imposed in America over the people living in America, and also people forcefully taken to America from Africa to America, was simply not enough. It was too simplistic, too Eurocentric, and so it was also a means to building a more complex, a more dynamic, a more balanced picture of what was going on in the colonial societies across the American continent. And bringing in the different kinds of subaltern groups involved in this history. With my modest means, I'm now focusing on some sectors of indigenous people living in the areas controlled by the Portuguese in America. But I also try to write this history or study this historical process in a kind of not just comparative but also interactive way. So similarly to what Adrian was describing, and his research is really inspirational for all of us. The sophisticated way he addresses the topics he was talking about is really very, very impressive. And what I also try to do, just like Adrian, is to establish bridges between different traditions of scholarship. Again, I'm mostly working on colonial Brazil, and within colonial Brazil, which is huge, as we all know, I focus and benefit a lot from the scholarship produced on Bahia, the captaincy of Bahia, and I'm lucky enough to have a lot of interaction with some outstanding scholars, historians and anthropologists from the Federal University of Bahia in Salvador. And so, while addressing those topics related to the context of Bahia, I always try to engage with a more international and broader scholarship devoted to colonial Americas. So again, it's a question of doing an in-depth survey about Brazil, but also engaging with the kind of questions and the kind of issues that are being debated at the more international level by different traditions of scholarship devoted to subalterns across the Americas during the colonial period. So it's comparative. I try to make it as comparative as possible, and also kind of interactive. So not just asking the same questions for different contexts across colonial America, but also see how developments taking place in these different contexts, sometimes they are the result of interactions and of the entangled nature of the history of colonial America. And Jorge Canizares' Guerra has brilliantly demonstrated that entangled character in a recent volume. So I find it also very inspirational and a very important dimension to take into account when addressing these topics.
Okay, thank you so much for your answers. I think that your answers takes us to this second question, who is how did categories or this construction to like mestizo, mulatto, and even indigenous enable dynamics of social mobility, protection, and even defense in moments of justice? And there's another one linked to this, who is how did these groups breaking the stability and natural correspondence of the categories assume and mobilize the categories to their advantage? Adrian.
Thank you, and that's a tough question. I'm going to try to answer it relatively quickly, but there's a lot to go, a lot of layers there. So one thing is, a lot of these categories that were deployed by vassals against each other, kind of through the crown, through viceroys or other bodies, a lot of them actually tended to restrict social mobility. There was a kind of a hostile element to a lot of these policies. Generally, the initial assumption is that Indians and Spaniards could be equal. There wasn't, the category mestizo didn't exist. The category mulatto didn't mean anything very specific in the early years. And then as these terms start to find their ways into royal decrees because of petitioning, they actually tend to kind of limit what indigenous people could do, what mestizos could do, what mulattos could do. And of course, when I say mestizos and mulattos, I'm not saying they're a real group, because they're absolutely not. And that's actually part of the mystery here. Is that in the 1530s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, until the 70s, no group of people exists calling themselves mestizos, and no group of people exists calling themselves mulattos, but this changes. So that's actually one of the dilemmas that these individuals face. Let's say that you're part African or part Black. Let's say that you're part indigenous, part Spanish. What do you do when a local official comes up and reads out in the plaza holding a royal decree and says, oh, mestizos aren't allowed to be priests anymore, and that's what you were actually training to do? What do? I mean, you don't feel like you're a mestizo. Same with a mulatto. A mulatto might say that he's a mulatto. He might say, look, I'm not a mulatto, then maybe there's a lot of truth to that. So you really had three choices if you were a vassal and a royal decree stated that you were a specific category. One is that you could accept the term. And then you could try to recover that social mobility, which we're looking for in the question, by actually transforming the meaning of the term by saying, no, mestizos are good. This particular group of mulattos, which I belong to, is good. And then you have a whole bunch of people sign 150 mestizos or 6,000 mulattos or whatever, and you get together. And then in a way, you're taking this invented category and you're, through this petitioning system, it's kind of becoming real, because you kind of have to say that you belong to it, and you have to interact with other people as if it were real. And then you're also saying to people from on the outside, no, we are mestizos, but mestizos are good. Don't worry about us. Let us back into the priesthood, and everything will be fine. So that's one approach that you could take. The second approach is, let's say that you're a mestizo and a royal decree says you can't carry a sword, or that you can't live in an indigenous town, specific indigenous town. You could come up to the viceroy or to the king and say, hey, could I please carry a sword? I'm a mestizo, but I'm a good mestizo. And then you would get a permission. And that's a really weird category then, because if you had a royal piece of permission, the category of document is an exception called gracia, which certain officials can grant an exception to the overall policy because the king has this magical power to change laws for specific cases. So if you're a mestizo who can't carry guns, but you have a paper saying that you're a mestizo, but that you can carry a gun, you're in this weird space where you're kind of a mestizo because you had to say that you were to get the permit, but people have to treat you like you're a Spaniard because you can carry the sword. very weird middle category. And in this weird middle category, all sorts of colonial drama erupts, of course. And then there's another approach in which the vassal says, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not a mestizo. And you could say, I'm actually a Spaniard. Everybody in my town considers me to be a Spaniard, so I'm a Spaniard. Or you could say, I'm not a mestizo, I'm an Indian, which means I can live in this Indian town. You could even, as an Indian, say, well, no, I'm actually a mestizo. I don't have to pay taxes. So there's this other category of evasion. So when you put these three together, this kind of like acceptance, this partial exemption, and then third, this evasion, things get really complicated. And then you get even more categories because someone might say, well, okay, fine. Your mom is half Indian and your dad is full Spanish. You're not a mestiza. You're a cuarterona. And then the person has to write the crown and say, well, these people called cuarterones and they're getting around things. And so you have to keep doing that. Now, of course, in a rational top-down system, all the rules would be written beforehand. In an irrational bottom-up system, you kind of have to keep creating these weird categories of exception. And what's really interesting for me about this is that groups that don't have a real biological or social existence before the royal decree comes out that describes them can create a social reality. Even mestizos can form brotherhoods with saints. They can have specific religious practices. They can have a chapel. They can run a hospital, the Hospital of the Mestizos of Cusco. And that kind of makes them a real category. But we see that they weren't a real category before. They were discriminated against only afterwards. And that really tells us about how complicated this issue of mestizo and mulatto, the relationship to social mobility is very complex. And with that, I'll cede the floor to Pedro.
Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, my perception of the topics raised by your question has many points of contact with what Adrian has just mentioned. I'm in the case of my research, I'm particularly interested in seeing basically two things that have in common the fact that they are like observing what is going on at the ground level with these categories you've mentioned, and how different actors operate with them and make use of them or are oppressed by these categories, because of course many of them have associated to them a lot of prejudices and also involved assigning a status that is really negative for those who are classified in a way or in a different way. And let me be more concrete. What I'm interested in understanding is how these categories brought by the Europeans to classify the very complex and heterogeneous human landscape of colonial America, then they function as resources for different kinds of actors to operate and to resist, to respond, to contest colonial order, but at the same time using those categories, and as Lauren Benton has stressed many years ago, by using the categories in a way, if an Amerindian or if an autochthonous person of America uses the category Indian to address or to talk with a colonial court in a way, this man or this woman is already accepting colonial rules. So this, of course, involves colonial rule, colonial domination, violence, etc. But it also involves a lot more things, like the capacity of these actors, many of them of indigenous descent, mulattoes, mestizos, to make use and make the best of these categories, to contest, to resist, to explore hesitations of the colonists. So colonial authorities very frequently hesitate about the status to assign. So these are precisely the situations I'm interested in, like discussions between inquisitors about whether the Inquisition has jurisdiction over a certain woman because she says, I'm not a mestizo, I'm an Indian. So this means, and I had never had contact with Christianity. So what kind of complexity, what kind of reality this episode I just mentioned reveals? It shows that a lot more people than we traditionally think became aware of these categories and how to make use of them to protect themselves or to contest colonial authorities. Like different jurisdictions, we are dealing with a world that was very, very plural in terms of jurisdictions. So the so-called colonized were very much aware of this plurality and how to explore the plurality, how to explore the hesitations between or the areas where different jurisdictions overlapped, what kind of implications, juridical implications different categories had in terms of their protection, or saying that some specific court was not competent to judge them. So, and this is all taking place at the ground level. And of course, ground level might mean Salvador de Bahia, one of the biggest cities in Portuguese America during the colonial period, or an ecclesiastical court in the middle of the backlands of Brazil, in which a meeting between the governor and representatives of the indigenous peoples and also representatives of the religious orders were discussing whether just war was applied, the criteria of just war was applied to a certain war the Portuguese were trying to conduct. So this is another good example of what I'm trying to explain here. Debates, discussions about just war are a fascinating field of inquiry, of study, to see how different actors in colonial society could operate, and in particular indigenous peoples and also people of African descent take advantage with the knowledge they have of many aspects of the European doctrine of just war, take advantage of these and in order to protect themselves, to contest colonial rule, or just try to refuse the authority of a certain colonial court to exert power over them. So this is my main focus of research, see how these discussions evolved at ground level.
Thank you, Pedro, and thank you, Adrian. Your answers are super amazing, and it's linked to the next question. Let's talk about the process. So, do you think these racial categories or these statutos create race, or whether race creates racial categories? And how does the law or the action of the law draw on extra legal sources in its construction of categories? Adrian, please.
Oh, wow, that's another really tricky question. I'll try to answer that with what I know. So one thing that's interesting is that in, say, let's say 1492 to 1555, to say, there isn't a good correspondence at all between what we might think of as race and racial laws. Like, there was only really a handful of things saying what a mulatto could or couldn't do, what a black person could or couldn't do, or even the category of Indian wasn't super defined. And you might argue it never actually becomes all that defined. You know, it's never as total a system as some scholarship makes it seem. But you definitely see greater specificity as things go on. So that means that there can't be a perfect correspondence between New World society's ideas, for example, of mulattos or negros or mestizos or Indians, and the laws. So to make the laws have to go to be written. There has to be a reason for the person to write the petition. The petition has to go on a mule train from Mexico City to Veracruz. It has to catch the boat. If the boat sinks, it doesn't get to the crown. If the crown doesn't like it, it doesn't get approved. And then, of course, the decree has to travel back to the New World and has to be implemented. And so there's a really bad correspondence between whatever people thought of human difference on the ground as a group and whatever the policies were. I mean, of course, I've also argued that sometimes when these decrees come back, you get the formation of mulatto communities, mestizo communities. Obviously, the indios, the indigenous people, kind of have to embrace the category of indio, of Indian, way before. We're talking 1520s, 1530s, or even earlier in some cases. So the decrees definitely change the structure of society, but the structure of racial ideas don't always translate to the decrees, which is a funny problem. But one other thing that's complicated is this doesn't tell us the entire story of how people felt about each other, about how one group felt about another group, or about how one person felt another group, because the petitions have such a bad correspondence. So you can't just write the history of race through the history of petitioning backwards. It doesn't work that way very easily either. And in fact, I don't even know if one can properly write the history of mentalities in that much depth. You can write the history of petitioning, fortunately, for some cases, because you have the petition and the decree, and then you have the attempt to enforce it, and that's nice when you get that correspondence. You kind of feel like you're actually hooking onto something more concrete. But the whole idea of what were Spanish attitudes towards mestizos in 1540, good question. I mean, there doesn't seem to be an easy answer. And then, of course, you know, if you get into the tricky question of what people mean exactly by race, then you have another problem, because as Pedro has said in his work, you have this idea of gentios, of generations, of lineages, of nations. It's very clear at times that a certain indigenous group might be a nation, or that someone from Angola might belong to a nation. Maybe they have a language, or a sort of ritual scarification, or maybe they wear certain clothing that makes them a nation. With mulatto and mestizo, no one knows what the heck to do, because the dad might be an important Spanish official, in which case, is he a mulatto if his dad is important? What if his mom is an important Indian woman, but his dad is a nobody Spaniard? Complicated. And so, yeah, very, very tricky, all of these questions. Then you get to the question of maybe racial categories working their ways into royal decrees, then, you know, impact Spanish American society enough, Indian society enough, that people start to reflect on those groups and then retroactively decide that they were natural, that there's something biological about mulattos, that there's something biological about indios or mestizos. And yeah, I think you kind of do see that a little bit around 1600 to 1620. You get a couple people saying that indigenous women's breast milk gives certain characteristics to mestizos. It's not really quite clear whether it's a metaphor. You know, there's this metaphor of blood, but sometimes it's very poetic and very fuzzy. It doesn't necessarily mean that blood transmutes characteristics. We should be very careful with those references. But it does seem to me that you get local conflicts, petitions come next, then you get royal decrees. The royal decrees tend to pressure people into forming groups or contesting groups. That reinforces the idea that the groups exist. And then sometimes you get a little bit of questions about racial fixity or biological fixity, or whether a group is a kind of permanently of a certain generation. Now then there's a question of jurists, right? You know, what are jurists doing in all this? Weirdly, in the 1500s, very little, which I think kind of goes against the historiography, right? We're oftentimes trained to ask first, what do the jurists say? What do the jurists say about mestizos and mulattos? Not much. It actually tends to be the procurator, the legal agent of one battling group in a litigation says, well, you know, I'll tell you something else about the defendant. The defendant, that scumbag, his mom is an Indian, which means he can't have this, that, or the other. And then the other guy says, well, yeah, well, you know, your guy, his grandfather was a Jew. And they go back and forth. Those conflicts are important, but they don't produce policies. They just produce juridical sentence, like outcomes. Party A is right, party B is wrong. Now, in other fields, gracia and gobierno, they're different paperwork fields. Different things happen. For example, royal grace, gracia, is this field of exception to laws. And there you see all sorts of these categories. Because like I said before, there's people, mestizos or mulattos, petitioning to carry swords, which they're not allowed to do. And so they have to say, I'm mestizo, I'm mulatto all the time. Then in gobierno, kind of administrative policy, that's where the rules are written. And so you get a lot of that. And the jurists sometimes will reflect on a case using gobierno and gracia rulings and say, well, you know, this is how we should deal with this problem in a court case. But that seems to me that they're trying to square away a world and make it neat for judges. And that's not always as important as what administrators are doing, what petitioners are doing, and that doesn't always happen through litigation, which kind of reduces the importance of jurists. We have to remember that presidents and governors and viceroys and the king weren't jurists. Jurists were there to solve disputes and also to counsel people engaging in certain kinds of disputes only. So I would say jurists and litigants don't really shape the structure of human categories of difference very much. It's really mainly royal officials and petitioners who are doing it. Pedro.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, again, my perception goes very much in the same direction as like Adrian has just mentioned. The kind of situations like, for instance, in the court case, you see a mestizo woman almost playing with these kind of categories that refer to race, because she's aware of the various potential of each one of the classifications she's dealing with. This is the kind of things that interest me, because they highlight the capacity of this section of colonial society to operate in a lot more active and complex way than we traditionally thought of. I'm not an expert in the history of race, racial categories. I tend to not. Adrian has mentioned that a while ago. I don't use the category race either very often when talking about colonial Brazil. I do use instead racial discrimination, like more as qualifying a social practice that combines certain notions and prejudices, negative prejudices about a certain group of people, and associated social practices of discrimination. So what I try to see is this interplay between so to say more doctrinal accounts about the differences between the various groups of human beings, and again at the ground level how these notions end up having an outcome in terms of defining how institutions operate, how society is shaped, how it is built, but also always bearing in mind that we're dealing with a population that has an enormous range of resources to respond in an active way to this set of categories. But coming from the Portuguese historiographic milieu, and I'm sorry to mention that so many times, but it's clearly that my outlook is influenced by that, ends up having some importance in the way I conceive it, because it's not that often that Portuguese historians acknowledge that colonial societies created or geared by the Portuguese all over the globe, beginning in the 16th century, were based on racial discrimination. As a matter of fact, racial discrimination and race are not an easy topic to address in present-day Portugal when talking about the colonial past. In particular, outside the academia, if you mention this outside the academic milieu, people often get angry because there is a deeply rooted idea that the Portuguese were not racist and racial discrimination was not at all the most structural and more relevant element of colonial societies of the Portuguese Empire. So this often generates a heated debate, and people get offended every time you mention that colonial societies built that resulted from the Portuguese conquest in Asia, Africa, and America were not meant to be egalitarian spaces based on an equal treatment of people of different ethnicities. On the contrary, they were designed, they were shaped in a very particular way in order to put people of Portuguese descent in the top positions of this society, and put all these groups of indigenous and of African descent in the lower ranks, in the lowest ranks of colonial society. So, so my answer to your question is a bit ambiguous, in the sense that although arguing that category race, I don't employ it very often when addressing colonial society of Brazil. This does not mean at all that I'm denying that there is racial discrimination. Many forms of discrimination based on a variety of things, of features. Some of them transmitted by blood or by other fluids and liquids produced by the human body. So it's not at all, for sure, not at all the kind of a biological and scientific racism we tend to associate to the late 18th century and as the outcome of the Enlightenment and so on and so forth. Not at all that, but it's clear that this kind of discrimination producing long-lasting effects is already there, and part of the discrimination is the product of the interplay between these more doctrinal views of the differences with the practices at the ground level, the discriminating practices at the ground level that end up producing a society with the shape of the colonial Brazil. This does not mean that miscegenation was not present. Of course, in some places it's massive, but this also means that if you want to climb in social hierarchy, and if you want to reach the nobility ranks, if you want to have access to certain important positions in colonial society, not to mention metropolitan society in Portugal, you need to hide a lot of racial features you have related to your African or Amerindian ancestry. So I think that tells you a lot also. The fact that that the only way for social climbing is hiding your indigenous features and your or the fact that you are of African descent tells a lot about the kind of society we're talking about when we talk about colonial Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Pedro. So last but not least, let's think about all these topics and the heritage and this that I call a long duration of these kind of discriminations and sometimes social practices in our society. So our fourth question is: do you believe that traces of these differentiating categories and logics of exclusion can be identified in contemporary societies? Adrian, please.
I always start this by saying that's a hard question. That's a hard question. Yeah, so I'm going to try to kind of be brief as I answer this, because there's a bunch of different directions that you could take this. The first is that definitely there's a heritage that's been passed down to us by complex chains of conceptual transmission from the 1500s and before to today. I think I can speak for Brazil as well as for the rest of Latin America, that, and even for Spain, Portugal, and parts of Africa, parts of Asia, we still talk about mestizos and mulatos. There's still words that we use. We still talk about indios. We all know that the term indio is a bizarre term, and yet we cannot get rid of it. And mestizo really isn't much better, because we're all kind of like, mestizo means mixed, but a mulato is also mixed. But a mulato, we don't even know where that term comes from, really. But we still use them. Why do we still use them? Well, because I would say there's a kind of archival weight. There's a transmission, a chain of transmission that these petitioners and these jurists and these officials participated in, and they created a conversation. The conversation has kept going. It survived in a book here and a document there, and kind of like a snowballing avalanche, it just kind of comes down to us in the present. Conceptually speaking, we still kind of work in those channels, which is interesting because, nobody necessarily knew what was going to happen to these categories after the 1800s, when Spanish-American nations emerge and when the Portuguese crown goes to Brazil and so forth. Especially after liberal societies emerge in the New World that say everyone's a citizen. What do you do with these categories then? Well, somehow they still persist in weird ways. So conceptually, we're definitely living within that heritage. Now, legally, it's a little bit trickier because, there's this idea that citizenship abolishes all of these things, and so definitely mulatto, mestizo, and other categories don't have as much weight. Of course, indio still does in a very important way. And there's other quilombolas and other groups still claim a sort of continuation, sort of nationhood or ethnicity, which still entitles them to certain protections, which resemble ancien regime elements, but now with the goal of creating equality and balance between the groups. And the ongoing inability of just about everybody involved to solve the problems looks very colonial, I think, to everybody. So in that way, there's also a long, very difficult legacy. So in social terms, how do these categories, how have they shaped things? That's really tough to answer. It's on the one hand, it's very obvious. If you were an enslaved person, you didn't accumulate as much wealth. You were cut out of certain institutions of higher education. And so, if you follow that lineage, you might assume, and I think normally you'd be right, that that you don't have as many opportunities as a person who traces their lineage back to a Portuguese or a Spanish aristocrat or an Italian or a German aristocrat in the New World. So that's definitely there. Now, conducting a study that would actually follow a family from 1520 to 2020 and showing all the different outcomes would be very interesting. And I'm sure that there would also be complexities there. Another thing is, in the system of privilege where different vassals of different groups are fighting each other, you also have issues. For example, a group of mulattos who have bought their freedom from their Spanish masters might move to the Caribbean, maybe somewhere around, Monterio or somewhere in the Caribbean of Costa Rica, and act as a militia against pirates to become Spaniards, to become noblemen, and they would fight with the intention of becoming military captains and so forth and working their way up, which partly explains certain histories of certain areas of Latin America. Why is this area whiter? Why is this area blacker? And so forth, sometimes might answer to these problems of, upward mobility, dealing with categories. Certain mestizos, for example, left the cities where they're being discriminated because laws had popped up after conflicts arose. They might go to Tucumán or New Mexico, or they might go to Manila, where they would become Spaniards. And so then there's also, the expansion of the Spanish Empire, possibly also the expansion of the Portuguese Empire, are sometimes related to these individuals trying to better their stations. And that's a major social impact, which might determine, for example, where Spanish or Portuguese are spoken today. And then you have this other issue of the so-called Indios Ladinos, in which indigenous peoples who live in indigenous communities move to cities. They decide that they don't want to pay taxes, and so they're going to become mestizos. And this has had a major impact on the integrity of indigenous cultures and on the flavor of city culture in Latin America and so forth. But I want to emphasize that it's not so simple. It's not like we're just living in the prison of the colonial times. Lots of things happened in the colonial era, which were radically different based on the area. Every 50 years, the situation might be different. And, you know, we've had, in the Spanish-American context, 200 years to either try to change things or fail to change things. And there's radically different outcomes in how people understand these things. So the colonial legacy thing is tricky for me, and I want to emphasize, especially, you know, a lot of US historians tend to imagine the Spanish Empire as this kind of ridiculous Baroque world of crazy categories and crazy things. And the casta paintings, these paintings of human difference, you know, maybe they were just souvenirs. Maybe they don't really reflect every single community and this mania for order. We have to be very careful with that. Another interesting area in which I think we are still living with mestizos, mulatos, indios, is state ideology. In Mexico, in Colombia to a certain extent, and Peru, Ecuador, other places, Chile, there's this idea of a kind of mestizo nation or certain mestizo areas, and that we're a pueblo mestizo, everybody, you know, dances around together, and we're this harmonious racial melting pot. Yeah, a lot of people are questioning that now after we saw that it was connected to indigenous people losing their languages, denying that Black people had any part in, for example, Mexican history. And so there's a kind of like toxic underbelly to this idea that the mestizo is what we're aiming for. And that actually goes back to colonial times when mestizos even were saying we live in a mestizo monarchy. It's mixed up between the Incas and the Aztecs and the Spanish. And that kind of like almost naive anti-Black and partly anti-indigenous ideology is only now starting to be reevaluated. And then on one other note, which I find very mysterious, is, you know, how did discrimination against different groups, for example, in the priesthood, impact how Catholicism spread around the world or didn't spread around the world? There's a lot of literature showing that there weren't that many priests in Mexico until the 1700s that weren't Spanish. Mestizo and indigenous priests only emerged very late. Peru is a little bit more in between. There's a lot more mestizo priests. And then the Philippines has a lot of mestizo native priests. And I mean, maybe the way that these categories played out are one of the reasons why religiosity is not expanding and might even be declining in some Latin American areas, whereas in the Philippines, Catholicism is very strong and very local. So I don't know, it's kind of a big mystery for historians to explore. And I think, you know, you need to deploy a whole army of historians to figure out exactly what the actual empirical impacts are. Pedro.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just like Adam, I find the question simultaneously a little bit tricky, but also, I mean, we could spend the rest of the afternoon or the rest of the day talking about it. Trying to be brief, I tend to be suspicious about these very linear connections a lot of people currently establish between forms of exploitation during the colonial period and forms of exploitation that exist in the present day world. I'm not saying that there is not a connection, of course there is, but it's often a lot more complex than you see it portrayed, the way you see it portrayed in the public debate in many contexts, including Portugal. I mean, but that said, I sometimes get struck by the persistence of ways of discriminating people of indigenous descent or African descent in present day world and present day official documents. To give you an example, a few years ago I had a chance to read a report produced by members of the Brazilian parliament, and the main issue was how to demarcate the lands of the indigenous living in the areas surrounding Trancoso and other towns in Bahia, in present-day Bahia. So the issue was how to establish, how to clarify which lands belong to the indigenous and which lands did not historically belong to the indigenous. And that report, produced by present-day Brazilian members of the parliament, many of them are very, very conservative MPs. And the way they described the indigenous peoples, the categories they employed, was impressive to me, because it looked as if in some ways colonial categories were still there. The colonial ways of discriminating, of downgrading, of establishing a difference between us and them, they were still there. Well, Adam has very correctly pointed out that a lot of things happened since the end of the colonial period, of course, and Latin American countries, including Brazil, had more than 200 years to change things. But it's also clear that in many respects, these new nations of the American continent were just as colonial as European powers in the way they dealt with indigenous peoples or people of African descent. And Brazil, I think it's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Now, another dimension of my experience, and sorry to put it always so personally, has to do with the interaction I've had in the past years with men and women from different indigenous peoples in Brazil. For different reasons, I had a chance to interact directly and talk with them, discuss with them, with indigenous activists and leaderships and intellectuals from different parts of Brazil, so indigenous men and women. And it is always fascinating to see the gap between our categories and the categories with which they still operate. They are familiar with our categories, but they can use them if they are talking with us, but they simply think that these categories are discriminating and not enough complex to account for the diversity of the world or their systems of knowledge. And so every time I interact with these women and men of coming from different indigenous peoples across Brazil, I have this very clear sense that these categories are first part of the colonial apparatus, which is in many respects still there in Brazil, and secondly, they are very local, because they are, well, the way these men and women from different indigenous peoples react every time I use the term mestiço or boato or so, I feel a bit kind of not really ignorant, but I feel that the Western world, in a way, has not succeeded to develop categories that account for that complexity, and is still operating with these categories that have a long colonial weight. The colonial overtones of these categories are very, very, very much there, but somehow, as Adam has pointed out, we still use them. So the category Indian, for instance, last year I helped organizing kind of not really a film festival, but it was we've invited a series of indigenous filmmakers from Brazil and also some indigenous activists, and they were to organize a film festival of films, cinema made by indigenous peoples in Brazil. So it was like 3 days in Lisbon, showing documentary films, fiction films. And they all had in common the fact that their authors were men and women of indigenous descent, or coming from indigenous peoples, indigenous communities. And of course, we invited them to be part of the organizing committee, because we didn't want to make it kind of a colonial thing, like imposing a format to them, and now please show your films. No, we gave them as much space as possible to have them as authors of that film festival, so to say. And one of the most vexed topics of discussions was the name. What kind of name should we give to these films? Is this indigenous films? Is this Indian? Is this Amerindian? Amerindian is definitely not a category they like, contrary to what I thought initially, like it's a more neutral thing or so. So there was a big debate about the name, and which of course has to do with the things we are discussing here. Indian. What are the potential? What is the potential, and also the limits of this category? And for those who were termed like that, it was clear to me that all these categories were not satisfactory at all. So I'm sorry to bring this very personal story to the debate, but I think it's telling also about one of the things that I'm having the privilege to do in the past years, which is having direct contact with these peoples and see and have the chance to discuss with them about many different topics, including the colonial past, and also somehow test our categories, the categories with which we operate, and see that in many ways they are not at all satisfactory for those who are labeled as Indian or indigenous. Indigenous is also a category that we could spend hours discussing here, right? So yeah, so that's it. Sorry for being so long.
No, thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Adrian. It was, I think, a wonderful conversation. I think we have a lot of questions, and sorry, the dog, and we have very good answers that fortunately open more questions, to researchers to think about it, to think in our everyday life about our past, and about what the memory of the colonial and early modern period, because sometimes we thought that this is very static, black and white society. It was, but it wasn't at all. So thanks a lot, and I hope to see you later in other situations, in other academic and social and public history projects. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you. Gracias, Mariana. Muito obrigado, Pedro.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you, Adrian. It was great seeing you, and let's keep in touch.
Let's keep in touch.
Yeah. So bye-bye. Stay safe. Bye.